Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining Lessons from the Pros, tour-tested strategies to play to your potential on the golf course. I'm Nicole Young. I'm the marketing coordinator for Private Vista, and I'll be your co-host for today. Before we get started, I'm just going to share a little bit about Private Vista, clue you in on some webinar housekeeping, and introduce you to our main hosts of the webinar. So starting with Private Vista, who are we? We are a financial planning and wealth management firm in the Chicagoland area. We manage approximately $2.5 billion in assets for our clients, and we have offices in both downtown Chicago and Oak Brook. We specialize in working with business executives, business owners, women in transition, retirees, families, and qualified plans. Now for the webinar, I just have a few housekeeping items to ensure that you're able to have the best webinar experience possible. You'll notice that you're going to be muted for the duration of the presentation, and this is just to ensure that everyone can hear our hosts clearly. If you run into any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me, Nicole Young, by using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can also see there in my box, I have my email listed, info@myprivatevista.com. Please feel free to send me any email questions that way or any technical questions that way as well. Lastly, if you'd like to ask a question, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of the event, so please save your questions for the end, and Matt will give you a little bit more instructions on that a little bit later. So finally, who are the other boxes on this screen right now? I would like to introduce everybody both to Matt Parenti and Dr. Rick Jensen. Starting with Matt. Matt Parenti is a partner and lead advisor at Private Vista. Matt's career began at the Advisors Group of Chicago in 2010 as a financial planning and investment analyst. Over 7 years of working there, Matt learned the careful practice of financial planning and also specialized in investment analysis. Eventually, Matt moved up to serve as an advisor and then joined Private Vista in 2017. As an advisor, Matt works to develop a trusting partnership with his clients by learning about their lives, personal and professional goals, and he tries to empathize with their struggles and live vicariously through their successes. Through careful research, Matt hopes to create and implement a sustainable financial and life plan. His fulfillment comes in seeing individuals and families that he works with realize their goals. Thank you for joining us today, Matt. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Rick Jensen. Dr. Rick Jensen is a renowned sports psychologist and author. In golf, his clients include more than 50 touring pros on the PGA and LPGA and Champions Tours, who have combined to win over 200 tour victories and 33 major championships. Dr. Rick Jensen has also trained tennis champions, including winners of all 4 Grand Slam championships. Dr. Rick Jensen is the author of Easier Said Than Done, the undeniable tour-tested truths you must know and apply to finally play to your potential on the golf course. He's been featured on ABC, ESPN, CNN, and the Golf Channel, and is also a contributing writer for Golf Digest and Golf Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Rick.
Great to be with you.
Awesome. So now that you know a little bit about both Matt and Dr. Rick Jensen, I think let's get this webinar started. Matt?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our Lessons from the Pros webinar. Again, just a quick reminder to use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask Dr. Rick a question during the webinar. And we'll save the last 10 minutes to answer some of those questions. So just raise your hand. I'll call on you in that last 10 minutes and just ask you to unmute yourself and ask a question. I would only ask that after you ask your question, if you could press mute again. We'll see how many questions we're able to get through. That being said, Dr. Rick, as I mentioned, the weather in Chicago today is snowy and cold. So I am just mentally out on a golf course right now. Hopefully this webinar does the same for everyone else. Yes, and you were nice enough to send me a copy of the book that Nicole mentioned. I did read it, and I would say you've done some amazing thing with the work of your clients. You've got your work cut out with me. Well, that being said, I was hoping to ask a little bit about you and your experience. Wanted to get into some of the mental aspects that you help golfers with, the physical aspects, talk about best practices for golf practice and taking lessons. And then lastly, wanted to ask some questions about just on the course management. So what our expectations should be out on the golf course. So before we get into all that, had some questions on your experience and working with pros. So help me understand what it is you help the pros with, and what are some common things that they ask you for?
Yeah. Well, in short, shooting lower golf scores, winning more tournaments, winning major championships. The outcomes matter when you're working at a professional level. So, where you think with some amateurs, some of you on the call may play golf for the social aspects, for the fitness aspects, for the ability to kind of be outside with friends. And I think that can be a different agenda than what pros are playing for their livelihood. They're really, so I would say my expertise in working with pros, as both a psychologist, I taught golf back when I was in college. I started teaching golf back in 1978. So I've taught golf a long time, but then I went to graduate school as to study to be a psychologist with a specialization in sports science, motor learning, sports psychology. Think of it as the science of skill acquisition. So how do you perform an athletic skill at a high level, with the idea of working with pros? So again, their agenda is very specific to how do we play better golf, hit the ball better, control the ball better, putt better, shoot lower scores, and then how do you do that under the pressure of tournament play and the pressure of the Ryder Cup, the Solheim Cup, of the Masters. And that's kind of where the sports psychology blends in with the actual skill of the game. They both matter. You have to be good, and then you have to think well, and the two combined is where people go with that. I think some psychologists get involved in just playing, again, I think there's a whole nother field of play this game for the enjoyment and the love of the game and the camaraderie and that as well. It's not really an area that I spend a lot of time in, but I do think it's acceptable and understandable why people would want to. Sometimes I think as amateurs, we get too caught up in our score. We don't have the time that pros have to put into their game. So sometimes our expectations are unrealistic, that we should play at a level that we expect to play at, but we don't have the time that they have to put into it.
Yeah. An interesting thing I pulled out from there is, the big difference being the livelihood of professional players. And I can just only imagine the stress and the pressure of being in some of those tournaments. I'm thinking the top players on the leaderboard Sunday at the Masters, last 5 holes, just immense pressure. And you've worked with people that have been in that position. So tell me a little bit about what specifically you tell pros about those moments and how to, not only get through them, but excel in those moments. What do you teach them?
It's frankly, Matt, it's more of a long-term training than it is a short-term, like, here's how we're going to play well at Augusta this week. So if they haven't trained to be there, there's not much you're going to do in the moment, to just get them to do that. So it's a progressive training of basically getting their body and their skill set to be resilient to pressure, if you think of it that way. So it's basically practicing in a way that you elevate the skill, and then over time progressively adding, I call them transfer conditions. And by transfer conditions, they're the conditions that exist in a major championship, that exist in tournament play. Club members may be able to relate more how it feels different when you're playing a member or a member guest or a corporate event, different than playing with your buddies on the weekend in your regular foursome. So it's imposing those conditions progressively over time to the skill set. So, and frankly, tour players are almost, once they get on tour, the tour itself does that. The tour has a number of tournaments. It has a number of majors. Certain tournaments are FedEx Cup valued, others are not. So there's there's certain variances in terms of the amount of pressure. They play different golf courses with different greens. So the transfer conditions, once you're on tour, are readily available to us. And now it's just a matter of training them while they're practicing in those conditions, where their thoughts should be, where their attention should be, how to control their heart rate, how to focus on the correct things, how to make the right decisions. So the mental side becomes kind of the processes of decision making, and then I call it self-regulation, or self-managing their own thoughts and feelings and reactions in physiology.
Yeah, so I definitely want to ask you a little bit about that, particularly for the average golfer like myself, and how we deal with those moments. But before we did, I had a couple other questions. One being, besides the obvious skill level, what separates the pros from everyone else, or the top tier pros from everyone else?
When you say everyone else from us,
Oh, everyone on
from
tour. Yeah.
everyone on tour, believe it or not, it's still skill level. I wouldn't have said that when I first started. I think when I first came out of graduate school and started work, I worked with college players that turned pro. I was a sports psychologist at the University of Florida, at Stanford, Tennessee, a number of universities. And then those guys turned, men and women both, I worked with, that made it on tour. And that kind of led to me having access to the tour. I fully expected, I think because I was young and hadn't been around enough players at that level, and I had spent 10 years in college trying to study to be a psychologist, a sports psychologist, I came onto the tour thinking, all right, I got all these, mental things in my toolbox I'm going to go apply to people in terms of, pre-shot routines and attention control training strategies and thought control training strategies. So, and you had always heard, the difference is it's all mental. Once you get on tour, everybody's good. Didn't find that to be true. That was not the case at all. There is a big difference from the number one player on tour to the number 100th player on tour, frankly, in skill. When you're I practice with them, spend most of my time practicing with them, and just the ball control itself, how well someone can chip a golf ball. You'll be with one person and they're practicing chipping and they're chipping balls in. And then you'll be with someone else on tour and they're chipping balls to 2 feet. Now to us, we don't notice the difference, right? Because we're like, I'll take a 2-footer on a chip all day long, right? Because
that's my best shot.
Right. The average tour player in practice will chip balls inside 3 feet when you're practicing the different holes. The top players will chip, you had 100 chip shots, the top players will chip 10 of those in. And you'll notice the difference. So that was probably the thing that stood out to me the most, was I realized how good the top players really are versus those that are trying to get there. So it still is primarily a game of skill, and then mental skills matter when they now get into contention, because they're not in contention all the time, right? And they're not on the Ryder Cup team or the Solheim Cup team all the time. So the mental side happens to become more important when they're in those situations that they frankly don't have access to all the time.
Yeah. And we keep going back to the idea of, the mental aspect of the game. And, maybe we talk a little bit about that with the average golfer. So I think about my own trials on the golf course as, just someone who plays in the summer. I'm lucky maybe once a week. But it just feels like there's a huge mental aspect to it, whether it's standing over a short putt, worried that I'm going to miss it, or, the nerves you get from even routine shots. What advice do you give golfers that you share with pros that might be applicable to the average golfer? Or, given what I've described, what would you tell the average golfer to deal with that?
There's some mental skills that apply to the game of golf differently than you might put in basketball or baseball or gymnastics, other sports. So there's certain mental skills that are specific to the game of golf that frankly apply to pros just as well as amateurs. The one contingency on that, and you said it before, is is, and I don't need to get into, my book speaks to it a lot, is skill matters. In other words, so think, the more developed your skill is, the more resilient it is to mental condition, to pressure, to people watching, to being in a tournament, to caring about your score. So I can't say it enough that the number one thing you can do to improve how good you play is get good, is to build your game. Because there's players, some of you, John Daly's of the world, who those of us that are would look at people like John Daly almost like the tin cup of tour golf, right? Like could just mentally have a lot of interference in his life. There's a lot of things going on with addictions in his life. Would kind of not focus all the time. He'd walk around with a cigarette and a big gulp, and you'd be like, wow, he was not, but the guy has won majors. So you look at that, he's won majors because of his skill set is so good. Then you get guys like Tiger Woods or ladies like Annika Sorenstam that have dominated golf at the top. These are people who not only from skill and fitness are there, but then you take the mental skills and put those together with that, and you have someone who really dominates consistently over time. If I had to outline what they are in order of importance for amateurs, probably the first one is just expectation management. Whatever term you put on that, it's having realistic expectations about the game and our likelihood of what we shoot. Tour players as well as amateurs, there's a lot of variability in this game that I have to even explain to tour players in terms of they shoot, their scoring averages on average about 68 and a half. They shoot plus or minus 5 of that scoring average on any given day. So their scoring average is really 63 to 73. And I have to speak of it more often in those terms so that they're not thinking because I can shoot 65, I should, or because my average score is 68, I should shoot 68 that day. Because the reality is if their scoring average is 68, 50% of the time they shoot 68 or higher, 50% of the time they shoot 68 or lower. So half the time, tour pros, as well as those of us on this call, shoot half the time we play below our average. And that's a statistical fact. Half the time, again, in tour players, variances are 10 shots. And so you'll hear amateurs many times go, how could I go out? Their average score might be 90, but they shot 96 one day and they shot 87 the day before. And they're like, how could I shoot 87 and 90? Well, you can, because you would have a 10 or 12 shot variance across your score. So much of a score on any given day is tied to the luck of the draw, like when you played good versus when you played poorly. So I'd say the most important thing is expectation management. Two other quick ones is what we would call attention control. And that's where do you focus your attention while you're playing a round of golf. Tour pros are fantastic at playing their attention. We call it narrow and external. So narrow would mean they play inside the ropes. They don't pay attention to the gallery. They don't pay attention to the scoreboard. They literally play golf one shot at a time. You'll see them always pulling their yardage book out because we've basically plotted that golf course in a yardage book. And they're just playing it like a game of pool. Like, where's the next shot? Where do I want it to land? And how do I get it there? Once they hit that shot, that shot's gone. Now they move on to another shot. They don't think about the context of the round. They just kind of run out of holes and then they add up their score. Amateurs too oftentimes are thinking about their score. They know where they stand. They know how many over or under. They know whether they add up the score after 9 holes, after 18. They know whether they're on track to beat their best score ever. They know if people are watching them from the first tee. So their attention oftentimes is on the context, the broad. It's not narrow like a tour player would be. The other thing amateurs do is they oftentimes are too internal. Tour players play external from their body. They hit putts to holes. They hit golf shots to the edge of a green with a cut falling into the center. They see the ball flying in the flight of a golf ball. Amateurs oftentimes are thinking through their golf swing and the parts of their golf swing. So their attention gets too internal. And that leads to the last skill, which I call thought control. Thought control for amateurs oftentimes it's what are you thinking while you're over the golf ball? And tour players are not really thinking anything. They're just rehearsing the shot in their mind. They're sensing the shot they're about to hit, and they're reacting to it. So their mind works as if we were going to get in the car and open the car door. Our mind would just picture us open. We just reach for the car door and open it. That's how they hit a golf shot. Amateurs are thinking about their last lesson, the last YouTube video they watched, the last tip they got from a golf pro, the last tip they got from a friend. So again, it causes poor thought control, can lead to poor attention control, because if you start thinking your way through a golf swing, your attention has to move internal to do that. And now it's kind of double jeopardy in those areas as well.
Yeah, so we'll talk about lessons in a bit, because I had some questions on that, but it sounds like, me, for instance, I go to lessons and, there's 3, 4, 5 things to keep in mind on my swing. And when I'm standing over the ball, I shouldn't be thinking of those things. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I should be practicing those things on the range. And when I'm standing over the ball, it should just be basically rehearsing what I practiced.
Yeah, and there's a reality of, if you're working on something in your swing, the idea is to try to package that into a feeling that you can play golf with, without having it to be 6 feelings, 5 feelings, 4 parts. You don't want to break your body into parts, but to feel like I'm keeping my weight forward on a chip shot. I can keep my weight forward and still watch the chip shot land on its spot and roll out to the hole, and frankly, keep that in my mind. So if I'm leaning left on a chip shot, I can do that at the same time of keeping my attention external. If I'm thinking lean left, hinge my wrist, turn my shoulders, and make sure to transfer my weight, now all of a sudden, all the demands of those multiple thoughts cause me to not remember where the hole is, not remember where my landing spot is. That's when it becomes problematic. Even tour players typically have a swing trigger or a swing feel that is similar to, or if not coached by their instructor, that they're working on while they're playing tournament play. They will have a thought, but the rule becomes, if the thought becomes so intense or so numerous that your attention cannot now know where the hole is, know where you're trying to flight the ball, know where your starting line is, you're thinking about too many things that way.
Yeah.
And that's the rule amateurs can follow. And frankly, teachers sometimes unknowingly lead amateurs right down that road. You could be a really good student taking lessons, working with a teacher, and teachers unknowingly, you and I were talking, Matt, before about the fact of training in a, indoors in a simulator. It's so easy when there's not a green, when there's no wind, when there's not a divot, to be so internal. And so when you train indoors on a mat with a teacher, particularly a teacher could sit talking to you about your backswing, the hinge at the top, getting the club on plane, start showing you video of your swing. And now you're trying to feel different things to try to get the club on plane in the video. That whole process alone, if you don't exit that process of like, all right, let's collectively put this into a feeling for you that you could play with, that should be the end of a lesson. But oftentimes it's not. The teacher doesn't know better to not do that. Students certainly wouldn't know that. Why would you know that? So if a teacher gives you 5 things to think about, students innocently leave and go, I guess that's what I'm supposed to think about.
Yeah.
Not so.
Yeah. Interesting that you bring up, our conversation about golfing indoors. So, as you know, we're in Chicago. A lot of the folks on the call are in Chicago, and a lot of our practice time is on a simulator. So talk a little bit about making that transition outside, because there is sort of a ramp up period.
What I would be doing if I was practicing indoors is I wouldn't even wait till I went outside, because I think the hard part is when you're on a mat, there's certain things about ball contact versus, let's call it ball flight, curvature, trajectory. Good simulators show, if you have a choice, you want something that shows the flight of the ball. I want to know whether I hit the ball higher or lower. I want to know that it curved. And I ideally want that what's called concurrent with my golf. As soon as I hit the ball, I want to be able to look in that screen and see that ball fly. If it's delayed, if I hit the ball and I wait and I kind of go, where'd that ball go? that's a problem from a learning point of view. If
Yeah.
if the computer has to calculate it and then after the fact produce a shot, the fact that it's not more live like we would see on a driving range is problematic. It's a little problematic as well as that you don't see the divot. So the feedback that you would get in terms of whether you hit the ball fat or thin is not as good. So the one thing I would do on a simulator is I would just tell players as I'm coaching them, hey, let's hit this one down the right side of the fair. So if you're hitting into a range, hit it to the right edge of the green, hit this one to the middle, hit this one to the left. Just keep moving the target around so the athlete feels as though there's a reason to be external, since we don't have a driving range out there. I have to do that outside as well with tour players. If, you know, I have to move the target around so that their brain doesn't get kind of drifting internal because they're just lined up square on, you know, on a mat in a driving range, like for instance, in a simulator, people just get used to being square to the mat that they're standing on. So they're not really orienting themselves to a target anymore. Then all of a sudden, when we go outside, all of a sudden we are, the tee box are set up odd. The greens are not always right in front of us. They're over to the side. And it takes a while for the brain to kind of come back and get to that. So I would try to do some of that indoors as well. And then obviously get outside as soon as you can, even if it's a little cold. If you can find places with heated stalls to go out to, a Top Golf, something where you can get out and have a target, do some of that intermittently over the winter as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice. You know, so speaking of advice, before we transition to more questions about practice and lessons and things like that, you know, what you and I do for a living are very different, but at the same time, there's a through line in that we both give advice. And you know, the advice that you're giving people to pros, they know a lot, but they're still coming to you for advice. So I'd be interested to hear your take on the value of advice and why you think it's so important.
I talk about this all the time because I work with a lot of financial advising firms, you know, in the corporate things that I do. And I think there's a ton of similarities between what you do and what I do, in the sense that I find that like top performers in golf look for more specialized advice. I've always said, like, for me, being a psychologist is not why someone on the PGA or LPGA tour would come to me. So they're in essence my ideal client, and they're certainly not just looking in the yellow pages for their local mental health center thinking, oh, I choked, I had a chance to win, you know, Pebble Beach and I didn't. So they certainly aren't walking down to the family, you know, the marriage and family clinic or the local mental health center to find somebody. They're going to ask around and look for someone who has more specialized expertise, not just, so you could take psychology, move it into what I call performance psychology, move that into golf psychology, and then move that into at a pro level. So they're doing that. As Nicole was doing your introduction and talk about Private Vista and kind of talking about, we work with business owners, we work with, you know, retirement plans. When she's listing the things that you all do, to me, that's what a golfer, touring pros are looking for, that, just like high net worth individuals or business owners or executives would look for people with your expertise as well. They can get other things, and you know this better than me. Golf is very commoditized today, in the sense of people don't need to come to me to learn to buy a golf glove, to get a golf ball, to hit, to frankly have access to a driving range or hit ball. So certain parts of golf are commoditized. They don't need specialized advice. They come to me to kind of, how do you win a major? How do you get good enough to compete on the tour? I think financial clients are same way. They can get certain things online in terms of just generic things about asset allocation or diversification. They're not coming to you to hear the broad-based things that they could pick up. They're coming to deal with their own particular situations. And I've always said that, I say it to my athletes, you know, take advantage of that. I have specialized knowledge in tour golf, so take advantage of that. You don't need me for the basics. They don't even come to me even for the basics of their swing mechanics. They get that from a teaching professional themselves.
Right. So speaking of swing mechanics and things like that, I want to talk a little bit about practice and lessons. So, there was a lot of mention in your book about what people should be spending their practice time on and what they should not be spending their practice time on. And there was a story that you had about Greg Norman that I thought was really interesting on that topic. Would you mind sharing that story and also how we should be spending our practice time as average golfers?
Yeah, happy to. I'll tell and in the book, because it's a book, I'd probably tell the short version of it. But when Greg was, in those that, again, depending on your age, Greg Norman was the Tiger Woods of the mid 80s, early 90s for about a decade, 85 to 95. He dominated golf. I was on the driving range with him in 1995. And I asked him, I said, why do you think you've been dominating this game lately? And he looks at me and he pointed at his chest and he goes, right here. And I said, what do you mean right here? And he said, I want it more. And I said, you want what more? And he said, I want to be number one more than anyone you know. No one wants it like I do. And I would agree that I've worked with a lot of players in golf and tennis. If there is a theme that underlines someone being at that level, it is this, what we call achievement motivation in psychology. It's the desire to be the best as you can be. And Billie Jean King in tennis, I'm thinking of people I've talked to. Billie Jean was no question, that's how she talked about tennis. Federer talks about tennis that way. Arnold Palmer said basically that same thing to me. So his main motive was, I want to be number one. And I said to him, I'm like, well, there's a ton of guys out here. We were on a driving range at the time we were having the conversation, Greg and I. And I said, well, there's a ton of these guys who want to be number one. I can't believe want is what separates you from them. And he goes, well, they don't want it like I do. And I'm like, yeah, they do. I'll go get 10 of my other clients they'll take number one in the world in a second. You can't tell me they don't want it. And he looks at me and he goes, well, they don't. He goes, they might want it, but I'll bet you they don't do with their want what I do with my want. And I said, like what? And he points at a pile of golf balls that he was hitting at the time. And he goes, well, for one thing, beat golf balls. He goes, there's not one of these guys who hit more balls than I do. And I said, well, how often do you come hit balls? He goes, every day. And I go, every day? He goes, yeah. He goes, not when I'm on a break. He goes, I'll take a break and I don't hit balls because I'm on break. He goes, but when I'm training golf and playing tournaments, I'm going 4 to 6 weeks at a time. He goes, so I'm doing 5 weeks at a time every day. I said, what time do you get out here each day to start hitting balls? And he looks at me and he goes, 20 minutes before light. And I'm like, what? And it was like it was on his watch. He goes, 20 minutes before light. I said, 20? He goes, always 20. And I said, why 20? And he says, stretching. And then he goes, my stretching routine takes exactly 20 minutes. I do it on the front bumper of my car in the parking lot in the dark with my headlights on. And then he points at me and he goes, you never stretch in the light. Light is for hitting golf balls. It's kind of sick, right? When you think about it from those of us on this call, we have lives, we have families, we have jobs. I mean, it's why they're so good. They're so good because frankly, they have other people managing their lives, managing their families, managing, their travel, and they are spending their time at the golf course that way. I then asked him, I said, so what do you work on? I asked him at what point, I said, well, how long do you stay there? He goes, until I can't see anymore. I said, then you don't go home till dark? He goes, I don't even go home at dark. I said, what do you mean? He goes, you don't go home at dark. He goes, I still have to go to the gym. I haven't done my workout yet. And he goes, and there's no way you could hit that many balls if you don't work out. And I said, well, how often do you work out? He goes, I work out about 5 to 6 days a week, 2 hours a day. And then he points at me and he goes, and I never work out in the light. Lights for hitting balls. So from a practice point of view, you're getting a sense of this is how Annika would practice the same way. Tiger would practice the same way, then go to the gym. Tiger would go to the gym in the morning. Tiger's routine was at the gym at 5, and he would be at the gym from 5 to 7, and then he'd go to the golf course on the back end of that way. But they both, all of them kind of see the day as opportunity to practice. I asked Greg, I said, when you're there all day, how do you decide what to work on? And he said, I work on the parts of my game that cost me the most shots in competition. And I'd write a chapter in my book about that you're probably referencing, right?
Yeah.
It's the idea of you have to know, it implies that one statement of I work on the parts of my game that cost me the most shots implies two things. One, what parts of the game are most important, and meaning which parts of the game correlate with the outcome of score, and then of those parts where your weaknesses are. So tour players know the most important aspects of the game statistically are first and foremost what they call total driving. Hitting the ball long and straight off the tee is first and most important. Second most important is then with your approach shot, keeping it on the green. So hitting greens in regulation with approach shots. And the third most important is putting. And then the fourth becomes your finesse game. If you miss the green, can you get it up and down?
Mm-hmm.
Then know which of those aspects of the game is contributing most to their score. So part of my background, like I'm a statistical geek. I can break down a player's game because I have access to all of their data. All the data on tour is each shot they hit is put into a computer, which I have access to all of that data. I can show a player, hey, you are giving up 0.6 shots per round in your wedge game between 70 and 100 yards, right? And you're losing another shot and a half on putts outside of 20 feet. I can break it right down into, so here's how we're then going to allocate our practice time in designing it. A long-winded story to say, work on your weaknesses, but only on the weaknesses that are the biggest contributors to work on weaknesses in driving, approach shot, putting, and short game. If you're not, don't spend all your time trying to hit a ball out of a divot. Don't spend all your time trying to hit a buried lie in the bunker. Specialty shots that don't come up that often are not the reasons why most of us aren't shooting to our potential.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I thought that was a really important takeaway, was this idea of, particularly for the amateur who's, as you said, has a family and work and other commitments. We have a set amount of time to practice. It's really using that time to practice the things that are affecting our game the most and our biggest weakness. So I thought that was really, really interesting insight. Speaking of lessons that we've talked about a little bit, I'm interested to hear what you'd recommend for the amateur in terms of a regimen for lessons or coaching. Just because, again, there's a time issue for a lot of people, but also, it's about using that time to get the right advice. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the regimen for the average golfer.
I have just I always say to amateurs, I'm like, don't take lessons if you don't practice. It's just wasted money. It'd be like me asking you for financial advice, but not executing any of it, right? So to ask someone for advice and not execute on the advice, it's kind of silly. So if you take lessons, I say lessons can do one of two things. They can give you structure and drills and training of things you would do in practice, ideally, or they could just tell you why you're bad. Right? Meaning if I take lessons and then every weekend go out and hit it and try to do what the lesson, I'm not going to be able to execute. If I take a lesson and then the only time I try the lesson is when I'm playing in my foursome on Sunday, I didn't give the lesson a chance to even take. I didn't hit any balls trying to develop that skill. I'm using tournament play or even just on course play to do that. I'd save the lesson money and then just understand that you're going to play to a certain handicap that way. But instruction with allocated, and again, amateurs, we have less time, but if you could put in, hey, two days a week, an hour to 2 hours a day of practice, the difference is we're not at a golf course sun up to sundown, so we're not going through every app, and then literally just work on your greatest weakness for a season. If your greatest weakness is you lose 4 balls around off the tee, work on your driving, work on your mechanics of your golf swing to kind of control that. Frankly, a lot of that works. If you're working on the mechanics in your golf swing to keep the ball in play, that has extra, that also applies to your iron play as well, right? You get the club more square, more on playing, get your posture right, your grip right. That's going to have dividends both on driving and iron play as well.
Yeah. Yeah, very nice. So in terms of practicing, it's just a matter of as much as we can. A lot of us, I think about myself, there's these plateaus you reach. So, maybe one season you'll get in more practice and your overall handicap will improve. But what is it that gets us past that plateau and onto the, to the next handicap, moving from a 17 to a 12? What is the best way to do that?
Frankly, if you're more serious about it, then I would tell even amateurs to do what we do with tour players. Tour players, I have access to statistics. There's programs out there, like one is like shotbyshot.com. Write that down. Shotbyshot.com is an amateur platform where there's some pros in the platform, but it's more situated for amateurs, run by this statistician, Peter Sanders, has tens of thousands of amateur data in those points. So Matt, if you were a 15 handicap and you put your data in there, and it's simple, it's on a phone. So after your round, you put, you go back through the round. I hit the fairway, hit the green, took me, my first putt was 10 feet. I two putted from 10 feet on next hole. And you just put that in. It basically will now not just handicap you. So at the end, it will go, yep, you're a 15, but it will go through and go, but you're not a 15 in putting. In putting, you're actually a 22, but your iron play is a 12 and your chipping is a 3. It will handicap the parts of the game, and then that will guide your practice and that will guide your training. So when you say, how do I break a plateau? If I'm a 15 and I want to be a 10, well, some of my skills might already be a 10. Does that make sense? But I've got it. Other skills are 20. So now I go in and I go to my teaching pro and I say, look, I want to work on these parts of my game because it's where there's the most room for gain. So I take the parts that are 20 and move those down. That's where, so I'm basically trying to find where's the opportunity that really exists in my game. That's how pros do it. Amateurs can do it. They just need the data to be able to have access to it.
Right.
Amateurs do just the opposite. Amateurs will, if you watch amateurs practice, they practice what they're good at because they get an ego boost from it. Like if we bomb the golf ball, the guy that bombs the golf ball is on the range with his driver all the time. One of the best putters I work with on tour, I've worked with him since he was in college for 20 years. He's been on tour he's the best putter I've ever seen, ever. In college, he was the best putter. He loved putting. So even with him, I would have to get him off the green. He will putt 4 hours a day and has since he's been in college. Everyone on tour acknowledges he's the best putter out there they've ever seen. Part of it is just time on task. But I have to force him to kind of go, let's work on your golf swing. Let's make sure let's work on your fitness level so you can hit it a little further. So you have to really be careful that you just don't overload in your strength because the opportunity is on the other side.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, I was just writing down shotbyshot.com because that sounds like a really nice piece of advice.
For the cost of a lesson, I mean, again, it's like $90. I don't know what Peter charges for it any longer, but again, it's for the cost of a lesson. It's less than the cost of a lesson for an entire year.
Yeah.
So it's one of the best investments you can make.
Yeah, very nice. You mentioned something in that Greg Norman story that I forgot to ask, and it was about two things as part of his regimen that I don't think a lot of golfers think about. And that's the physical aspect of it. So, whether it be stretching or working out, how important is that to the game? Because I feel like a lot of amateurs, it's just drive to the course, get out of the car, take a couple of swings, and then get onto the tee box. What sort of things should average golfers be doing from a physical nature, and how important is it?
And I write I put a chapter in my book. I think the title was, fitness will set the ceiling to your golf game. So it sets a ceiling, meaning you can get good. And at some point you hit a capacity of you only have so much flexibility. You only can generate so much speed. You can't just hit the ball further purely by hitting it in the center of the face. You can't swing the club faster if you can't be more flexible, if you don't have more ballistic speed in your golf swing. So tour players are incredibly fit today. It's why the game is so fantastic today because athletes are now playing this game. Again, I've been in the game a long time ago. 30 years ago, there were athletes, but there are also a lot of people who like to have a good drink. It was kind of a, there wasn't as much money in the game and there weren't as many athletes. So all the athletes were playing baseball, basketball, football, and yet the golfers were kind of the ones who didn't do that. Today, you're getting people who play golf that also played all those other sports. So much of it for amateurs is purely flexibility. It's not like you have to go be Arnold Schwarzenegger in a gym and get bulky. You do have to have, so you get guys like Rory McIlroy, weighs 150 pounds, hits at 330 yards. All right. So you don't have to be bulked up in terms of muscle, but you do need to be flexible enough and be able to kind of set the club and really add speed to it. Much of it is just for amateurs fatigue as well. They don't pay attention to the fact that we're not aerobically as fit as we need to be. And even, and so we just get fatigued in terms of sustained energy for 4 or 5 hours. So even if we're in a golf cart, we're not getting tired in the sense of like, we're not running a marathon, but fitness levels tied to attentional levels. So if you're out there for 5 hours, the more cardiovascularly fit you are, the healthier you are, the more your attention will be sustained for 5 hours. So some people just can't sustain the energy output required to play golf for 4 to 5 hours without fatiguing. So you'll even see patterns that they just don't finish well coming, after hole 13. Add drinking to that, and now you got another problem because now you've added a depressant into the body for the first 2.5 hours, and that's part of it. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, again, there's different, like the Titleist Performance Institute. It's called TPI. There are certain people you could Google online. TPI certified instructors are fitness professionals and sometimes golf professionals who have been trained on the fitness of golf. So it's probably the most certified credential in golf fitness. And again, you could Google TPI certified golf instructor in my area, and I think it's tpi.com. They actually have a map, and you can go where you live, and you can put it in, and it will pop up people, and you could just go get a fitness consult, and they'll put you on a program that you could just start doing, frankly, right out of your home.
Wow. That's great. And Dr. Rick, I was going to say, we're getting towards the last 10 minutes here. You are a wealth of knowledge, and it'd be selfish of me not to allow other people to ask a couple of questions. So what I'll do now is I will open it up to anyone who might have any questions. If you want to ask a question, just click the raise your hand button, and we'll take a couple of questions for Dr. Rick. Okay, we've got one here. Oh, we've got a lot. Okay.
I'll keep my short answers brief then.
Yeah. Jake Falcon, I'll allow you to ask a question if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can, Jake. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Matt, for hosting this. And thank you, Dr. Rick Jensen. I'll be quick because you said you had a lot of questions. So I play golf both socially and competitively. And I have an issue when I go and play competitively, my scores aren't as low. And you'd think it'd be because I was nervous, but I think it's the opposite. I don't really care, even though I am out there to play competitively. I have a hard time, I guess, amping myself up. So do you have any suggestions on that?
Jake, well, the short answer is usually it based on you saying amping yourself up and how you respond differently, there's what's called intensity management, so think of it as how intense your heart rate is or your engagement level is. So with tour players, to keep it simple, I put them on heart rate monitors and we can kind of get their heart rate to where they like to be. But there's an ideal engagement level or heart rate level in which golfers play their best golf. When people play different levels in different environments, I do actually hear it opposite of what you're saying. So it's interesting that you do find typically people like tour players won't play well in the pro-ams, but then their heart rate gets amped up for tournament play and they need tournament play for their heart rate and their engagement level and frankly their attention to be hooked. And so they, let's say on a scale from 1 to 10 when they play pro-ams, they'll say I'm a 3 or a 4, but when I get into a tournament, I feel like I'm a 6 or a 7. and they play better at a 6 or a 7. So intensity management is the ability to move your heart rate there through your own learning to engage, taking more practice swings, getting out of the cart and walking. You're doing the opposite of that, probably. I would just, as simple, on a scale from 0 to 10, where do you like and there's not a right or wrong, there's a right for you. Would you give yourself a 5, a 6, a 7, a 3? A Fred Couples is a low arousal player. Tiger Woods was a high arousal player. Wherever you fall, I'd start trying to get you to get to that level and sustain that level throughout a round. And typically, probably what's happening when you're in a tournament, yeah, because you don't care, you're dropping down a few levels from where you'd ideally need to be. I'd get you to just, if you don't care, I'd say, well, then create a side bet with someone to make you care. Like I would be side betting you. I'd do that with tour players. I'll bet them $100 for every birdie they make, just to engage them in a pro-am, something like that, to get their heart rate back.
That's great advice. We've got another question from Ed. Ed, I've allowed you to talk, so if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hello.
Hey.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Rick, and thank you, Matt, for presenting this information. Excellent, I appreciate it. My question quickly is that in the aspect of taking a lot of practice swings and walking the course into, again, you talked about the fatigue factor. Is that something that you kind of look at too, is how people address the ball, how many swings they take prior to really hitting the ball? Because I've found that I'm trying to do that less, and I'm probably doing better hitting the ball.
Yeah, I just say anything more than keep doing that, Ed. I would agree with you. If you're finding that you're getting fatigued, practice swings really are there. Some people take practice swings like they're practicing, and practice swings have very little correlation to the actual swing that you hit. You'll hear many people say, why is my practice swing so good and then my actual swing isn't? And it's because when there's a ball there, your brain produces a different motor program anyways to strike the golf ball. So the practice swing doesn't need to be anything other than just get your muscles warmed up. It'd be the equivalent of even if you just stretched before you swung the club. So it's really not a practice swing. It's really just moving my muscles before I hit a ball. So there's not, I would just support exactly what you're doing. To sit there and hit a bunch of ballistic practice swings when they don't correlate that much to the golf swing itself anyways is probably fatiguing you. So yeah, get out of the cart as long as you're loose, take a couple swings, a waggle, and go.
Great. Thanks, Ed. I think we have time for another one. So I'm going to unmute Mike. Mike, if you want to ask your question. Get him unmuted here.
There we go. Hey, thanks so much. Just quick, and if you don't want to answer it, I'll appreciate you anyway. Who was the golfer that you worked with and is notably the best putter on the tour today? Who was the name? Garrett?
I can't say the name because of my license, Mike, because I'm a licensed psychologist. So if I can talk about, I wish I would have just said, here's who I knew was the best player on tour, but he has been a client of mine. So I can't say it because I can't disclose clients without their release.
No problem. Thank you so much for your, appreciate it.
All those statistics are available. I don't know, again, whether he's ranked there right at this week, because they'll redo the statistics, but it's not hard to figure out who the best putters are that way.
I had one question, and it was just about courses, just, in the spirit of, I've got a little Pebble Beach sweater on. You talk to all of these pros. What is the favorite course of the pros? And have you seen any courses that are your favorite?
They'd be different. Like their favorites are the major. Like I think they definitely favor Augusta National only because of the allure and kind of where it has been in their life. So when they get there, they see that course as like Xanadu, right? They live their whole life watching people win it. They're aspiring to be pros. I frankly, again, if this is being taped, probably pause the tape. I don't see that course that way at all. Like I get that it has historical value, and the historical value causes them to see the golf course through a lens. But I always have said, if I drop somebody into Augusta that had never been there, I'm dropping you into a very well manicured golf course in Georgia. And it has that nature. What you see on TV, it doesn't look the same in person. It's frankly more severe in person than what you see on TV, but TV does give it these iconic views in terms of the azaleas and the images that way. I've always liked just courses that have more, like I grew up in Florida. I'd never have liked Florida golf courses. I think they're just sand and water. And I like courses but again, I think it's personal for me, that are tree line. So if you hit it in the tree, you've got to scramble, you've got to be able to hit shots, decide when to chip out, when to go for it. So anything that, but again, I grew up in the Northeast prior to moving to Florida. And I kind of, as a kid, was in that. I think golf is very personal. People have their own sense of what golf courses they like. So I don't know that my opinion would carry much weight there at all.
Well, I had to ask. But anyway, we're running out of time. I could do this all day, but unfortunately we got to wrap up so that the folks on the call can get to their 1 o'clocks if they've got them. So Dr. Rick, thank you so much. This was so great and such a pleasure. And I really enjoyed your books, and I wrote down some advice during our session today, and I'll be certain to follow it. So thank you.
Thanks for putting it all together as well. And Nicole, to you as well for everything you did. Nev as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to pop on really quick and just say thank you to our guests, everyone that logged in today. And I want to say that I really hope you enjoyed the webinar and some of that knowledge that you gained, and hope that you're able to take your game to the next level. I want to say thank you to Matt, because I mean, what an awesome host from Private Vista. Thank you so much, Matt. And then Dr. Rick, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. You sent both Matt and I your books, which we both read and loved. Although I'm not a golf person, I learned a lot. And now I know a bit about golf, which is just fantastic. So we really appreciate everyone's time, everyone who logged on. Dr. Rick, Matt, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.